science into classrooms around the world. And of course, there are no classrooms right now. All of you are stuck at home. So we so appreciate our live group joining us at Miss Michael's class in Glenview, Illinois today for being here. Thank you so much. And for all our groups tuning in on YouTube as well from across Canada, the US, and internationally in some cases. So today we are going to dive in with a new speaker to Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. We are joined live in Virginia by Nick Caruso. So he is a biologist, a scientist, a conservationist from Virginia who works on herps, so reptiles and amphibians, specifically salamanders, one of my very favorite groups of creatures in the world. He is also a best-selling author of the book Does It Fart, as well as the books True or Poo and Believe It or Snot. Some really fantastic titles. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us today, Nick, and take us away.
Yeah, thanks for having me on here. I guess I need to share my screen, right? Yeah.
I'll let you know when it's up and all good.
Okay, there we go.
Looks great, go for it.
Okay, so this is kind of just a collage of some of the things that I think represent what I do in terms of studying salamanders. A lot of my focus is on their population biology, which I'm going to get into that, aspects of like their growth and survival, as well as writing books, which hopefully you've heard of before, but if not, you're going to hear about today. So just, oh wait, there we go. So here's my just kind of brief about me. My current position is a research scientist at Virginia Tech. Most of my research, as I mentioned, focused on ecology and conservation. And so trying to understand the relationship between different species and their environment, as well as how can we ensure that these species persist long term, especially in areas where we need to manage the habitat. Much of my previous research has focused on arguably the best group of species, Appalachian salamanders. However, some of my current stuff focuses on reptiles and amphibians in the Florida panhandle, and I'm going to go into all of that. But I also have written popular science books, including Does It Fart, True or Poo, and Believe It or Snot, and Believe It or Snot, which two of those books, the first two, Does It Fart and True or Poo, are now kids versions as well. So I'm going to start off talking about my role or my job as a research scientist and basically how I got here, the journey I took along the way. So just kind of real brief, I've started off with a bachelor's from St. Louis University. I got my master's from University of Maryland, and then finished up my Ph.D. just a couple of years ago at the University of Alabama. And so, like I said before, a lot of that research has focused on Appalachian salamanders, specifically a group in the genus Plethodon, which are known as the eastern woodland salamanders. And here's just a couple different species. So on the top left is the northern gray-cheeked salamander. The one on the mushroom there in the middle top is the Analasi salamander. There's a set of eggs on the right by the redback salamander, which is just below it that we found. On the bottom left is the white-spotted salamander, a little baby that just hatched fairly recently, as you can see how small it is. And then in the bottom middle is a very aptly named red-legged salamander. As you can see with its nice red legs. So one of the cool things about these salamanders, unlike us, they don't have any lungs. So they breathe completely through their skin, which means they need to keep their skin nice and wet and stay in cool habitats in order to bring oxygen into their skin and have carbon dioxide leave their skin. So their entire skin basically acts as their lung. So amphibians in general do this, but this group of salamanders don't have any lungs to accompany their skin breathing, which is really unique. Another cool these species is that in some areas they are incredibly abundant, and so studies have found that the amount of biomass or weight in these populations, even though these species are only a couple inches, some of these individuals are only a couple inches big, that there's more biomass in their populations or weight, total weight of them, than all the small mammals and birds combined in that same area. So even though some other animals might be a lot bigger, there's just a lot of these things. And you might be asking yourself, well, how come I maybe never seen these? Because a lot of times all these critters are just underground because they don't like to be out in the harsh environment, in the sun, when it's windy out. They're often only out during the day, at night. So if you're out in the daytime, you may not even see them. However, if you go out at night, especially after a nice rain, these things are like a carpet. Oh, there's my cat. These things can be like a carpet on the forest floor. They're just everywhere. I was waiting for him to jump up. He just can't resist himself. And another cool thing about working in the Southern Appalachians is it's actually a biodiversity hotspot. So this graph just shows a number of salamander species, different counties in the US. And so that dark area there's, it's known as the salamander capital of the world. So you can find more salamander species in some of these habitats than anywhere else. So it's an incredibly just beautiful place to work in. And if you want to find salamanders, this is the place to be, and I love it. And so what does that look like? What does it look like studying salamanders in the wild? So just going over some of my previous work, a lot of my research is focused on understanding the role of how climate can shape species ranges or their distributions over time and space. So kind of breaking it down to, why are these species over here and these ones are over here? And so what climate factors like temperature and precipitation are driving, presence and absence of different individuals and species. I've actually done some research as well, looking at a chytrid fungus disease throughout the Appalachians as well in these communities. But I'm going to focus on that first thing, which has been a lot of my research. So here's an idea of what field work kind of looks like. So in order to find some of these species, you have to go to very remote places. Oftentimes we're backpacking in. Your tent, your food, your water, everything you're bringing up on your back, and you got to hike into, a few, maybe dozen miles or so to get to some of these locations to find certain species. Because again, these species require these cool, moist conditions. It's kind of like a rainforest in these areas. So you're basically just getting rained on a lot, which is just, sometimes it's fun, sometimes it's a little rough. But at the bottom picture there, showing some of the most beautiful scenery that I've ever seen in the Southern Appalachians. So it's a lot of hiking, a lot of really cool areas. It's very remote, don't often see a whole lot of other people, which I guess is not too different than my life right now. Just instead of a home with a roof, I have a canvas tent that sometimes leaks. And of course, those field work, there's lots of fun stories. So one of my favorite is actually my very first night during my master's research. I was waiting for people to come join me to help me with my research. So I got there a day ahead to set things up. And so I was there by myself camping. And about 3 in the morning, I was woken up because a bear had visited my tent, and I was all by myself. There was no one else around me. Fortunately, that bear just kind of wanted to sniff and check out what was going on. And it kind of just hung out around my tent. It ended up kind of getting into my water bottle a little bit and biting into that. I don't know why it wanted my water bottle, but it did. And fortunately, nothing happened to me. But it was a pretty interesting kind of encounter my very first night. Just, I guess, the bear wanted to see who had came to visit him. So it was kind of interesting. But it's pretty regular occurrence to encounter bears in these habitats, and generally they just kind of run away. So they're not too interested in being around us. So when we actually go out to study these animals, a lot of our techniques are fairly basic. We go out and we'll measure individuals, count how many are out there. But of course, when we're out in these remote locations, you don't have, a whole lab at your disposal. So at the top left is my mobile lab, which is basically a full table and chair that I had out of the back of my truck, where I could process salamanders, take their weights, their body size, and whether they're male or female, if the females had eggs or not, those kind of data. I've also done mesocosm experiments, which are just basically you try to create little habitats for individuals where you can manipulate things, but also keep individuals where they are. So like I mentioned before, these salamanders like to be underground. So if you're trying to find the same exact individual, it can often be very difficult because you'll just never see it for a very long time. So if you're able to keep it in little bins, you can track individuals' growth over time. As I mentioned before, a lot of our work, my work has taken place at night. So this is often what we see. In the middle there is a completely pitch black picture, only lit up by our headlamps. So we have little lights on top of our heads, and that's all that the light source that we have. So that's how we go about finding salamanders. On the top right there is just a picture of a field site, where different salamander locations were marked by flags so we can return them back in the same spot. So one of the cool things about these salamanders is, there's so many cool things, let's be honest, is that they don't really move much. So I've tracked individuals over years, and I will find them in the same exact spot, maybe a meter at most away from where they were. They don't really like to go away from their kind of home area. So if you catch them, it's always important to return them exactly where you found them, because that's where they like to be. And on the bottom right is a really cool thing. So I'm going to go back a couple slides. So this salamander on the top left, it's the northern gray cheek salamander. You notice that its whole body is just this black color. It's got some gray on its tail and gray on its cheeks, which it gets its name from. There's not a whole lot about this individual that you could identify it versus other individuals. And so one of the ways that we can go about do that to track individuals over time is we actually give them unique tattoos. And so this individual I had given tattoos in different spots of its body. So it's color that glows under UV light. And so I can identify that individual as red, blue, blank, blue. And so I had different color combinations on different individuals, and all I had to do was shine a UV light on them, and I'd know who is who. And so I could track them over time. And so I can measure things like how much they've grown, which ones have survived, if certain animals have matured over the years, or if females have laid eggs that year or not. So there's lots of questions that you couldn't answer otherwise. So it's a pretty cool technique, and I am at this point, because I've tattooed just thousands of salamanders, I am a salamander tattoo expert. If you ever need a salamander tattooed, you just come to me. I can do that. I'm very good at it. So that's some of the methods that we've employed for doing field work. And of course, if we're looking at how populations have changed, one of the cool tools that we can at our disposal is looking back at specimens collected in a museum. So you can measure individuals that have been collected 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And again, another cool thing about these species is that you can age them using their bones. So on the right-hand side of this is two cross sections of the femur, which is the big bone in their leg, and in your leg as well. And so what happens is these salamanders during the winter, they hibernate. And during that time, because they're inactive, they're not eating, they're not growing, they produce these thick lines, thin thin, darker lines in their bones that denote a yearly event of hibernation. And so if you've got animals in the museum, you can take those femurs, cut them, take cross sections of them and put them under a microscope and actually count those rings to see how old those individuals are and how much they've grown over those years. So this is a really cool tool that we have. And this is pretty similar to what we can do with trees. So they're basically like tree rings. So you can look at, the amount of growth that occurred between 2 different years or something like that. And so this just shows us a couple individuals. One, I think, was in its 3rd year at the top, or 3rd or 4th year, and the one on the bottom was in its like 8th year. So one of the questions I get was always like, how long do salamanders live? And I think people will be pretty surprised that they're fairly long-lived animals. Some species, can live 10, 15, maybe up to 20 years in the wild. And again, these things are like this big. They're really small. So it's pretty unique being able to work with these critters. So just a little bit on my current work. So that's all work I've done for my master's and PhD work. I am doing some more work in the Southern Appalachians with salamanders, but mostly focusing on how we can manage forests for both harvesting trees and salamanders. So, I know we all try to use as little paper as possible. We don't like to waste things, but paper is a necessity in our life. So we need to be able to harvest trees, and we need to do it in a sustainable way for both our use and for the salamander population. So my current work now is focused on how can we maximize, what we're taking from these forests, but also leaving appropriate habitat for these salamanders, because they do require these old growth trees in order to provide a nice canopy for them so they can stay in these cool and wet conditions. My other work takes place in the Florida Panhandle on Eglin Air Force Base, which is pretty unique, working on a military installation. My main project works with the flatwood salamanders. It's an endangered species. Unlike these terrestrial salamanders, this species will breed in temporary ponds. So during the winters, the adults will migrate to the ponds, lay their eggs on land, which is really, really cool, and wait for the water to fill up and inundate or overflow onto the eggs. So rather than laying them directly in the water, they just lay them on the land and hope that the rains will actually flood the ponds. They then hatch, and then the larvae will be in the ponds for a dozen weeks or so, and then metamorphose, and then leave the ponds, and then go back out into the forest. So my main project now is trying to understand how climate influences the pond filling and drying, because we want to know, one, what is going on currently. So how do temperature and precipitation influence if a pond is filled or not in a given year, but also look into the future and predict, are these ponds going to have water during the appropriate times of the year for these salamanders. We're also interested in trying to understand how to manage these federal lands for two other species that are of conservation concern, the gopher tortoise and bog frog. Both have pretty restricted ranges. The bog frog really has a small range that's almost entirely on Eglin Air Force Base, if not, it is entirely on it. I think it might be a little off the Air Force Base. But these species need some nice open canopy habitat. So trying to understand how we can, manage these federal lands for both the Air Force, but also for these species to persist because they happen to have their ranges also in this area. So it's been really neat working in conjunction with the Air Force and with the federal government on these projects. Unfortunately, I don't have as much cool pictures and stories because this is basically what I do now. I sit in front of a computer even before working from home. I don't go out in the field much anymore. I have data sent to me and I work it up. and do a lot of modeling and trying to go through the data to make sense of what we've collected. So this is an adequate representation of my current day-to-day life, but I still get to look at my cool fieldwork pictures. So now just talk a little bit about my author stuff. So it's kind of a weird story how I got to where I am. And it all started on social media, on Twitter. This story, basically, a colleague of mine, Danny Rabiati, had asked a snake expert, David Steen, if snakes farted, because her brother had asked her and she didn't know. His reply was yes, but a rather unenthusiastic one. I saw this exchange and said, you know what? This is why Does It Fart needs to be a thing. And Danny suggested that we should start a spreadsheet and start having other scientists weigh in on if their study species farted or not, and the evidence for it. And so we did. We started a Google spreadsheet, opened it up to all of our science colleagues, and before we knew it, we had dozens of people entering data into this Google spreadsheet about whether or not different species farted, which was pretty incredible. I thought it was just kind of a funny question. And before we knew it, we were approached if we wanted to turn this into a book, and we're like, yeah, let's do that. And it somehow turned into a bestseller. And it's a really cool idea of not just whether or not a different species farts, which is, I think, an interesting question in itself, but also the scientific evidence for why or why not. So what is it about their digestive system or their diet? Do they have particularly smelly farts or particularly long farts or something like that? So there's a lot of questions beyond just does X animal fart. Since we've written these books, we've written 3 others. 2 of them then turned into, we've also turned into children's versions where they're just simpler text and more illustrated and colored illustrations, but also these books can be found in over a dozen languages across the world. Which is really, it's something that I still just cannot believe when I look at all the books that I have now with my name on it in so many different languages. So if you have questions over that, I'd be happy to take them or over my research stuff, but hopefully I didn't take too much time. I think that was close to about 15
you were
minutes.
great, Nick. That was fantastic, man. Well, thanks so much for an awesome presentation. Some very cool books, and some, your salamander fieldwork stories are fantastic. For our groups joining in on YouTube as well, just let me know where you're joining from and share questions there, and I'll take as many as I possibly can. Nick, I want to know right off the bat, because one of the reasons that I got in touch with you originally to set up this presentation is this idea that your books are viable online and you will sign them for people and send them. Is that correct?
Yeah, so we started that over the holiday season in the winter. I haven't kept up with it since, but if people want to get in touch with me for signed copies, more than happy to do it. So we actually started that as a kind of a promotion with some of the local charities where however many books people bought, we would donate money based on the number or whatever to different charities for conservation and for science education as well. But yeah, I'm more than happy to sign books for people if you want me to. I can purchase them and sign them, or you can buy them, send them to me, and I can send them back. That kind of stuff is, yeah.
Just want to make sure that we encourage people to maybe buy some of those fantastic books of yours, and do check them out online, and we'll share resources to do that after with Miss Michael's class and on YouTube. Nick, if you want to come out of screen share so we can see you again, that would be fantastic. I'm going to come to the students in Miss Michael's group in a second, but I love this question from Miss Holden in Spruce Grove, Alberta. She wants to know, how do you go about tattooing a salamander? What are you using? How are you doing this?
That's a great question. So the material is called a visible implant elastomer. So it's a liquid that when you mix it, it's a polymer that when you mix it with another liquid, it will harden into this kind of gel, like it's kind of elasticy. So yeah, I'm not quite sure how to explain exactly what it is. So it's not quite like a solid, it's not quite a liquid, but basically we'll mix that up, those two compounds together, put it into a syringe, and it's a very small syringe for these little salamanders, and inject it into the body cavity. So you're not, injecting it into any organs or anything like that. So you're just a small amount of this liquid, and then really quickly it hardens into this kind of elastic material, and then it stays under their skin, especially when you're tattooing them on the underside of their body. Predators can't see that because they're on the ground. So you don't want to tattoo, put bright colors on these things on the top of their body, so like a bird might see them easily.
Might as well just write in "eat me" into the back.
Right.
Fantastic. Very cool. Thanks, Nick. All right, I'm going to go to Riley, the fish kid, joining us live on YouTube from Ms. Michael's group. So if you want to take us away, come on up, man. Let's just get your mic demuted. Perfect. Go for it.
Okay. So I was wondering, let's say you lived in Illinois like me, and your kid wanted to find a salamander. How would you go about finding one?
Great question.
So I am from Missouri, and I started my graduate work in Illinois. So I have found salamanders in Illinois.
Cool.
So my suggestion would be to look in kind of wet places, maybe some small streams, or really like kind of dense forested areas. And if you're looking for them, because you typically don't want to go, walking around the woods at night because you can't see very well. So if you're going during the day, you would look underneath rocks and logs. And that's where you generally find them, because that's where they'll be during the daytime. They'll shelter under there because they're generally cooler and wetter underneath those areas than, if they're just out in the open. But again, one of the important things is to return those objects as soon as you flip them, because that is potentially someone's home. So you want to put that right back.
Really glad we got that message, and thanks, Nick. Fantastic. So I'm going to go check out for some salamanders too. I'm excited. All right, we're going to go to Connor now, Miss Michael's class, who found your book titles the most uproariously funny of any of Miss Michael's students. So Connor, come on up, man. Ask us a question.
Okay, my question is, how do you get a tattoo on such a little thing? Like, what? Is he going to be the next Rock Johnson? Is he going to be fully laid out with tattoos?
So it's just a little kind of like dot that we're giving them. So I haven't, because it's not part of our, scientific protocol, given them any elaborate tattoos. It's more just a little dot of color that we can identify them. But yeah, it's a very careful process, because you want to, inject them just enough to get it just under their skin, but you don't want to hurt them.
Yeah.
And so luckily these things can regenerate tissue very easily, so it's not that big of a deal for them.
I thought it would be like a full-on dragon tattoo on the back. Like, I am a dragon now.
We'll do a follow-up session on that later, Connor, man. I'm so excited for the foot-long dragon tattoo. Maybe like big salamanders. Hey, Nick, there are big salamanders. Actually, I know you work with smaller ones. Could you explain a little bit about some of the bigger ones in the world?
Yeah, so in the U.S., our big salamander is the eastern hellbender. It can get about, I think about 2 feet in length. And then there are some in Asia that can get, I think, about 5 feet in length. So, like the size of an adult almost, pretty big. And for those animals, because they're a bit bigger, we can actually put in microchips into them, kind of similar to what we put into a dog or a cat. When they chip them so that they can find them if those animals get loose. But because I work with these tiny little salamanders, those microchips are still too big to put into their bodies. That's why I have to use the tattoo technique.
I guess tattoos are found with every animal.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks, Connor. All right, I'm going to take a few more questions. You mentioned hurting salamanders a few times, but this doesn't hurt them. And so we've heard before in amphibian presentations the idea of chemicals on your hands. So salamanders breathe through their skin. Now, just as a lesson to all our kids, if you have sunscreen on, if you have something, should you be touching salamanders or any amphibians or not?
No, so yeah, that can transfer. People ask me all the time because I do work in the woods, and they're like, "Oh, what do you do about mosquitoes?" And it's like, you just let them bite you, because we can't wear mosquito repellent or sunscreen or any of that stuff because it can affect their breathing, getting on their skin. Their skin is very porous, unlike ours. Anything can hurt them. And even just our holding them. So we'll wear gloves as well, doing this work. So that we don't, kind of inadvertently hurt these animals.
Yeah, I'm really glad we got that in. Thanks, Nick. All right, Kinley wants to know, how many salamander species have you discovered? Have you discovered any new species or seen in person if you haven't discovered any?
I have not, that I know of. So, again, like, there's an incredible amount of diversity in the Southern Appalachians, and people have been discovering new species even recently. To my knowledge, I've never have. I've caught a lot of species, but my research is more trying to understand how these individuals or populations are related to the climate. So I don't quite look into the genetics of these populations to look if they're different or not. I haven't done any of that research. But it's possible I've come across species that haven't been identified.
Maybe I found a secret one, or one was watching you from the treetop or something. But
right.
No, that's nice. You highlighted research in a lot of different places around the U.S. and one of the most biodiverse hotspots for them in the world. So it's really cool, and I'm glad to share that today. I had no idea that the southwestern or southeastern U.S. was so rich in salamanders. That's fantastic.
It's incredible.
All right, I want to share one last question before we wrap up. Amazingly, we're near the end of the time. For your books, why do you think it's so important to highlight science topics in a way that is fun and accessible for kids? Ms. Michael shared with her students the idea that scientists don't need to be brutally serious all the time, and I think that's a really valuable lesson. Can you explain a little bit about your experience with that?
Yeah, I'm pretty much never serious. I'm just gonna put that out there right now. My wife can definitely confirm that. I think making subjects approachable is a very important aspect of science. When I write scientific papers, I use a much different voice and a different kind of language, and that often isn't accessible throughout the world. So kind of bridging that gap and using maybe some humorous subjects about like farts, it can just kind of help get people interested. So we can talk about the gas that animals release out of their bodies, and then I can talk about how salamanders don't have lungs, and then they exchange gas across their skin. So I think there's a lot of really cool opportunities to use stuff like that, but to kind of I always say it's like kind of get people's attention first, and then reel them in with the science.
It's the gateway. It's the thing that encourages them to check out the thing, and then they learn all these other fantastic stories that you told in this presentation. So I'm so glad you get a chance to do that, and I hope we get a lot of people really keen to get your books, because they are fantastic books. For our students joining us live and on YouTube, if you haven't had a chance to check them out, amazing resources, a lot of fun. Nick is every bit as fun in writing as he is in person, so do check those out. Nick, on that note, actually, as we're wrapping up, for kids at home that want to learn more about you and the work that you do, is there a place that we can send them? Is there a website, or where can they find your book? How can they get more information?
Yeah, our books can be found anywhere that you can find books, online, independent booksellers, all that stuff. They should be, as long as they're in stock, they'll be available, as well as audio book versions and ebook versions. There's all that different resources available. I'm mostly just available through Twitter. I think that's the only social media that I use. So I can put it in the chat, because it's not gonna translate well to
Photo Nick is hard to say, I know.
Yeah, so it's because I worked with this genus of salamanders, Plethodon, and my name is Nick. I made my handle Plethodonic. But it's not the most easiest thing to send for people to understand exactly what that means when I say it out loud, so I like to spell it out.
In the chat bar.
And then I can put in my, oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say it's in the chat bar for all our live groups, and I'll share it on YouTube too right now, Nick, okay?
Okay. And then my website there, if you want to get in touch with me through there, I put it in as well. I'm really bad about checking any of that though, but generally Twitter is the easiest way to get in touch with me.
Fantastic. Well, I encourage all our kids to do that. Do let us know at Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. I'm Miss Michael, and for our groups online, email us at ebtsoyp@gmail.com. It's our initials at gmail.com, and we'll put you in touch with Nick if you guys want to get a book, because we'd love to sell a bunch of books for you guys.
Yeah.
And last but not least, as a resource I personally loved, if you're interested in amphibians and reptiles in general, Life in Cold Blood, which is a British Broadcasting Corporation series and book. Thank you for the enthusiastic head nod affirmation, Nick. It was a great resource for people at home. But yeah, so what we do at the end of every session, Nick, is I'm going to demute everyone's microphone. So our entire classroom is Michael's group. If you want to demute all your microphones and join me in saying a huge thank you to Nick for joining us today in Virginia, you should all be demuted. Go for it. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thanks for doing this.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for joining in today, everyone. For everyone on YouTube, do check us out on our YouTube page. You can subscribe to us there. Social media, learn more about Nick. We'll share all that in the chat bar. Nick, thanks again for joining us. Have a wonderful
And
rest of the day.
Thanks.
And I vote a student.
All right.
If you
Bye for now,
enjoyed this, let your teachers know, and we'll do it again. Okay, so let your teachers know, and they'll let me know.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
All right.